Okay, I think we will get started. So good evening and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is a nice crowd, and we thank you for being here at Politics and Prose, and by doing so, supporting the bookstore and supporting the events that we put on. And tonight for Christian Parenti's book, Tropic of Chaos, and so we welcome him for that. So I do welcome you here on behalf of our two owners, Brad Graham and Lissa Muscatine, who are just recently bought the bookstore from Barbara Mead and Carla Cohen. So we're excited to have them on board, and all the booksellers here. So again, just a thank you and a welcome. And for those of you new to the store, I will just quickly go over the format tonight, and that is that Christian will talk about the book, read a little bit from it, and then we'll open it up to you for Q&A, which we look forward to, your input. And the one thing we ask is that if you just get to this microphone in the middle here, it will keep the talk audible. We're recording tonight, and so we welcome our C-SPAN audience as well. So when it comes time for Q&A, we'll just field them from this microphone, and then afterwards we'll have a book signing up here. And that is how it will go. Usually a good idea to turn off your cell phones, and that will, in a small space, the ring can kind of resonate. So, but again, welcome, and just another thanks for being here. Christian Parenti, a Nation contributing editor, fellow at the Nation Institute, and a visiting scholar at the SUNY Graduate Center. Here tonight to talk about his new book, Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change in the New Geography of Violence. He's authored 3 previous books, including Lockdown America, and Christian's books are available for sale in the front of the store this evening. The Tropic of Chaos, as Christian describes it, is a belt of economically and politically battered post-colonial states girding the planet's mid-latitudes. The societies in this belt are also heavily dependent on agriculture and fishing, thus very vulnerable to shifts in weather patterns. His book is about how the environment, how climate change, droughts and floods say, and their impact on energy distribution, how climate change accelerates existing civil and ethnic disputes in this area, the Tropic of Chaos. And that some of these conflicts in Afghanistan, Somalia, Brazil, say, are not solely the result of general infighting or economic deprivation or political disorder. Rather, collectively, they are made worse by climate change in what Christian calls a catastrophic convergence. His book is divided into 4 sections, 3 of which deal with each region, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And in examining the current and future impact of climate change in these regions, he has looked at the historical relevance of these places as well, the history of counterinsurgency, say, land ownership, fallout from the Cold War. And so we are very pleased to have him here at Politics and Prose to talk about it, and happy to have you here participating as well. So please help me welcome to Politics and Prose, Christian Parenti.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight on a lovely summer evening. And thanks for the kind introduction. And as was hinted at in the introduction, I mean, the thesis of this book, in a nutshell, is that that climate change doesn't just look like bad weather; it also looks like ethnic violence, religious violence, civil war, banditry, counterinsurgency, xenophobic anti-immigrant policing. And what I try to do is tease out in these different situations the causality, the causal role of climate change. And I never argue that climate change is the sole driving force of violence in any one place, but that it is a contributing factor. And it always works in conjunction with pre-existing crises. The idea of the book came to me when I was reporting on the heroin economy in Afghanistan. And farmers there, I would ask them, why were they growing this illegal crop and running the risks that came with that of getting arrested, having their crops destroyed by the government? And part of the answer that came up again and again in different places over a series of years was, well, poppy is very drought resistant. And at first, I didn't know that there was a drought in Afghanistan. Turns out that Afghanistan is suffering the worst drought in living memory, which has coincided with the whole NATO project of nation building in Afghanistan. And poppy uses 1/5 to 1/6 the amount of water that wheat requires. So given this drought, this very severe drought, the worst in living memory, it's really one of the only crops that's economically viable for farmers in Afghanistan. So it occurred to me that along with all of the religious reasons one might have for joining the Taliban, or all the ethnic reasons one might have for joining the Taliban, there was an economic motivation as well, which was linked to climate change. Because in the war, there are two positions on poppy. NATO and the Afghan government oppose it and attack it, frequently, more often than not, just in rhetoric, because there's so much corruption that people can buy their way out of the eradication programs. But that doesn't mean that eradication isn't onerous for the farmer or a threat. And the other side, the Taliban, defend the farmer's right to grow poppy. So in facing this drought and adapting to it through poppy, farmers have this economic motivation to support the Taliban, because that is the side in the conflict that will defend their right to grow the one crop that's really economically viable given the environmental crisis they face. People get confused about the Taliban and poppy. They supported Taliban. They supported poppy production when they were in power, except for 1 year, due to international pressure and also a sort of a glut in the opium supplies. And for 1 year, right before 9/11, they in fact eradicated poppy. But they supported it historically, and they support it now. So with that in mind, I set out to try and find other examples of how this worked. And what happened again and again was it seemed to me that that climate change worked through these pre-existing crises, as I mentioned, in different combinations in different places. Those pre-existing crises are fundamentally the military legacy of the Cold War and the economic damage of radical free market economic policies that have been pushed by the World Bank and IMF upon the Global South over the last 20 years. So the legacy of the Cold War and neoliberal economic restructuring, you could say. The legacy of the Cold War, in a nutshell, in much of the Global South, which was the site of the very hot proxy wars within the Cold War, is an oversupply of cheap weapons, a social fabric that has been ripped to pieces by attacking civilian populations who have been dislocated from their original places and reconstituted and urbanized, and networks of men trained in smuggling, assassination, small arms tactics. These are either former guerrillas or former police and military, or the former paramilitaries set up by governments. And once the Cold War was over, the detritus of the Cold War did not go away with it. There were still bands of armed men moving weapons in one direction, conflict resources out in another direction, or drugs out. And the result is continued insurgency without a real cause or a new cause. Political insurgency becomes religious insurgency, or just crime waves built upon this infrastructure. You see that in Central America, where the murder rate in places like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Honduras frequently rivals the death toll of many years during the Civil War. But there's no cause. There are no clear sides in a war. There's just this military hardware and leftover military training and society traumatized by war and all of this killing going on. So that's one legacy that has preset the stage in the Global South for crisis. The other legacy of neoliberal economic restructuring. What is that? It's essentially a program of removing the state from economic activity. And it's important to remember that from the 1930s, really particularly from the end of World War II until the 1970s, the prevailing ideas in development economics in the West about how to develop capitalist economies in the Global South held that there should be a robust and important role for the state. There should be planning, there should be public investment, and that the state was an important component of developing capitalism. The ideas that are implemented by the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, shift radically in the late 70s.